Montana Territory, 1876. The unforgiving frontier had taught Isaac Quinn one harsh truth: a man could only count on himself. As dawn broke over the rugged landscape, painting the distant mountains in amber and gold, he stood alone at the edge of his modest cattle ranch, watching the sunrise with eyes hardened by years of solitude. At 26, Isaac had the weathered look of a man who'd lived twice that long. His face remained handsome, strong jawline softened by 2 days of light stubble, striking blue eyes that missed nothing, and a lean, muscular build earned through years of breaking horses and driving cattle. Yet beneath his worn Stetson hat and capable exterior lay a soul convinced that love was a luxury the frontier didn't allow, not for men like him. "A man who opens his heart out here is just asking for the vultures to circle," he muttered to his horse, adjusting the saddle with practiced hands. The small herd of cattle he'd painstakingly built represented everything he believed in: tangible assets that couldn't abandon you, couldn't die of fever in the winter, couldn't be taken by raiders without a fighting chance. Isaac had watched too many homesteaders arrive with hope in their eyes and wives on their arms, only to leave broken, if they left at all. The graveyard in nearby Silver Creek told that story well enough. No, he had decided long ago that the frontier demanded a singular focus on survival. Love was a distraction he couldn't afford, a weakness that could cost everything. As he mounted his horse and surveyed his modest spread, Isaac felt the familiar emptiness that came with the quiet mornings. His small two-room cabin stood solitary against the backdrop of mountains, smoke curling from the chimney where he'd lit the morning fire before heading out. Sometimes, in moments of weakness, he imagined what it might be like to return to something more than empty rooms and cold coffee. But those thoughts were dangerous. Isaac had built his life on the premise that needing no one meant never being disappointed. It had worked for him so far, or so he told himself as he rode toward town for supplies, unaware that everything he believed was about to be challenged. Silver Creek was hardly more than a wide spot in the trail: a general store, saloon, small church, blacksmith, and a handful of other establishments strung along a single dusty street. Isaac typically limited his visits, taking no pleasure in the drunken revelry or idle gossip that passed for entertainment. Tying his horse outside the general store, he noticed a commotion down the street. A stagecoach had arrived, nothing unusual, but the crowd gathering suggested something out of the ordinary. Isaac would have ignored it entirely if not for the desperate cry that cut through the morning air: "Please, someone help us." Against his better judgment, Isaac found himself walking toward the disturbance. The stagecoach sat at an awkward angle, one wheel clearly damaged. But it wasn't the coach that caught his attention, it was the young woman standing beside it, her face flushed with distress. Theresa Moore was 21 years old, though her composure suggested someone older. Her honey-blonde hair was coming loose from its pins, framing a face that combined delicate features with surprising determination. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue, now dusty from the journey but still maintaining an air of Eastern refinement. What struck Isaac most, however, were her eyes, intelligent, alert, and currently blazing with frustration as she argued with the stage driver. "What do you mean you cannot fix it until tomorrow? There must be someone who can help now." The driver shook his head. "Wheels busted good, miss. Blacksmith's backed up with work. Earliest we leave is tomorrow afternoon." "But my uncle is expecting me today. His ranch is only a few miles from here. Surely someone can." "Which ranch?" Isaac found himself asking, stepping forward before he could reconsider. The young woman turned, noticing him for the first time. For a moment she assessed him with a careful gaze that suggested she wasn't one to trust strangers easily, a wise attitude on the frontier. "Mapleton Ranch," she replied cautiously. "My uncle is Robert Mapleton." Isaac's eyebrows rose slightly. Old man Mapleton's place bordered his own property to the north. He'd had limited dealings with the older rancher, finding him fair but private. "I know the place," Isaac said. "I could take you there." The offer surprised him as much as it did her. This wasn't his problem. He had supplies to buy and work waiting, yet something in her composure, the way she faced the setback with dignity rather than helpless tears, stirred something unfamiliar. "And you are," she asked, straightforward and unafraid, "Isaac Quinn." "My ranch borders your uncle's property." She studied him a moment longer, weighing her options. The driver shrugged. "Quinn's all right, miss, keeps to himself mostly, but he's honest." "I am Theresa Moore," she finally said, extending her hand with an Eastern formality that seemed out of place on the dusty street. "My uncle's letters mentioned a neighbor named Quinn. I would be grateful for your assistance." As Isaac took her offered hand, A strange sensation passed through him, the first genuine human connection he'd felt in longer than he cared to remember. It unsettled him deeply. This was precisely the kind of entanglement he avoided, yet here he was, offering help to a stranger whose very presence contradicted everything he believed about frontier life. "I'll need to gather my supplies first," he said, withdrawing his hand perhaps too quickly. "Meet me here in 20 minutes." The journey to Mapleton's ranch would typically take Isaac less than an hour alone, but with Theresa riding beside him on a borrowed horse, it stretched considerably longer. She rode well enough but clearly hadn't spent much time in the saddle. More problematic were her belongings, two substantial trunks they'd transferred from the stagecoach to Isaac's packhorse. "I hope I'm not imposing too greatly," she said as they rode side by side. "I understand this isn't what you planned for your day." Isaac shrugged. "Doesn't matter, I was heading back this direction anyway." A silence fell between them, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a distant hawk. Isaac found himself stealing glances at his companion, noting how she took in the landscape with genuine interest rather than the fear or disdain he'd seen in other Eastern visitors. "It's beautiful," she said finally, gesturing to the panoramic view of mountains and rolling grassland. "Different from Pennsylvania, but beautiful in its own way." "Pennsylvania?" he asked, curiosity getting the better of him. "Philadelphia," she clarified. "I lived there with my parents until—" she paused, a shadow passing over her features, "until they passed last winter, influenza." Isaac nodded, recognizing the grief she carried. Death was a familiar companion on the frontier, but that didn't make its visitations any easier. "I'm sorry," he offered, the words feeling inadequate. "Thank you," she replied simply. After a moment she continued, "Uncle Robert is my mother's brother. We corresponded regularly, but I haven't seen him since I was a child. When I found myself alone, his invitation to come west seemed like providence." Isaac wanted to warn her that the frontier was no place for a city-raised young woman, that the romantic notions Easterners held about Western life rarely survived first contact with reality. But something in her steady gaze suggested Theresa Moore wasn't harboring illusions. "Your uncle's a good man," he said instead. "Keeps his fences mended and his cattle where they belong. That's about all you can ask for in a neighbor out here." She smiled at that, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "High praise indeed, Mr. Quinn." "Isaac," he corrected automatically, then wondered why he'd done so. He didn't invite familiarity from anyone. "Isaac," she repeated, and something about the way his name sounded in her voice made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't define. "Then you must call me Theresa." They crested a rise and Mapleton's ranch came into view, a sprawling affair compared to Isaac's modest holding. A two-story house stood proudly among several outbuildings, with corrals and a barn suggesting prosperity built over decades. "There it is," Isaac said, relieved to have reached their destination. The sooner he delivered Theresa Moore to her uncle, the sooner he could return to his orderly, solitary existence. But as they approached, something seemed wrong. No smoke rose from the chimney. No ranch hands moved about the property. The place held an unnatural stillness that set Isaac's instincts on edge. "Wait here," he instructed, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. "What's wrong?" Theresa asked, tensing in her saddle. "Probably nothing," he lied, "but stay here anyway." Isaac approached cautiously, years of frontier wariness guiding his movements. He dismounted at the hitching post, noting the absence of horses in the nearby corral. The front door stood partially open, another warning sign. "Hello, the house," he called out, following frontier protocol. "Robert, it's Isaac Quinn." The silence that answered confirmed his suspicions. Something was very wrong. Drawing his revolver, Isaac entered the house, moving carefully from room to room. The interior showed no signs of violence or struggle, but an open letter on the table caught his attention. He scanned it quickly, frowning at its contents. Outside, he found Theresa had ignored his instructions and dismounted, standing anxiously by the horses. "Your uncle isn't here," Isaac said, holding out the letter. "Looks like he was called to Helena on urgent business 3 days ago, some legal matter with his land title. Says here he expected to return tomorrow or the day after." Theresa's composure faltered for the first time. "But where are the ranch hands? Surely someone should be here." Isaac grimaced. "Letter mentions he took his foreman with him for the legal testimony. As for the others," he glanced around the property. "My guess is they took advantage of the boss being away, probably in town spending their wages on whiskey and cards." The implication hung between them. Theresa stood alone, miles from town, with no family present and night approaching within hours. Her face paled slightly as she processed this reality. "I see," she said finally, straightening her shoulders. "Well, I suppose I shall have to manage until my uncle returns. Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Isaac. I won't keep you any longer." Her dignity in that moment, the stubborn refusal to appear vulnerable despite her obvious distress, stirred something unexpected in Isaac's chest. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to wish her well and ride away. This wasn't his problem. He had spent years ensuring he had no obligations beyond his own survival. Yet the thought of leaving a young woman alone on an isolated ranch, especially with nightfall approaching, violated every code of frontier conduct he'd been raised with. "You can't stay here alone," he said firmly. "I assure you I am quite capable." "It's not about capability," he interrupted. "It's not safe. Even if there's no trouble, which isn't guaranteed, you don't know how to operate this place. Water, food, dealing with any stock that might return looking for feed." She blinked, clearly not having considered these practicalities. "What do you suggest, then? Return to town?" Isaac sighed, already regretting the words forming in his mouth. "You'll stay at my place until your uncle returns. I have a spare room. It's not much, but it's proper enough." Teresa's eyes widened slightly. "That would hardly be appropriate. We've only just met." "More appropriate than alternatives," Isaac countered. "Your reputation will survive. Out here, practical solutions trump social niceties." She considered this, weighing propriety against practicality. Finally, she nodded. "Very well, I accept your hospitality until my uncle returns." Her tone suggested she was granting a royal concession rather than accepting help, and despite himself, Isaac found his mouth quirking into something dangerously close to a smile. "Let's leave a note for your uncle," he said, "in case he returns early. Then we should go. I want to reach my place before dark." As they rode away from Mapleton's ranch, Isaac couldn't shake the feeling that he had just upended his carefully constructed life. For years he had maintained his isolation like a fortress wall. Now, with one impulsive decision, he had invited a stranger through the gates. Theresa Moore represented everything he had determined to avoid: complication, responsibility, connection. Yet as she rode beside him, her back straight despite hours in the saddle, Isaac found himself wondering if his long-held beliefs about frontier life might be more habit than truth. It was a dangerous thought, one he quickly buried beneath practical concerns about accommodations and propriety. But the seed had been planted, taking root in soil he'd thought too barren for such growth. The journey to Isaac's ranch passed in relative silence, each rider lost in their own thoughts. As they approached his modest homestead just before sunset, Isaac found himself seeing it through new eyes: the small cabin with its weather-beaten exterior, the lean-to stable, the modest corral that held his spare horses. It wasn't much compared to Mapleton's spread, but he had built it himself, and until this moment it had seemed sufficient. "This is your home?" Theresa asked as they dismounted, her tone carefully neutral. "It's not much," Isaac acknowledged, suddenly self-conscious, "but it keeps the weather out and the heat in." She studied the cabin, then turned to him with a smile that held no judgment. "It looks sturdy and well-built. That matters more than size, especially out here." Something in her assessment, practical rather than pitying, eased the tension in Isaac's shoulders. He led her inside, acutely aware of how rarely anyone other than himself crossed this threshold. The interior consisted of 2 rooms, the main living area with a stone fireplace, small table and cook stove, and a bedroom just large enough for his bed and trunk. Isaac gestured to the bedroom door. "You can take the bed. I'll sleep out here by the fire." Theresa looked ready to protest, then seemed to reconsider. "Thank you, that's very gentlemanly." Isaac busied himself building a fire, grateful for the task that prevented further conversation. The situation felt unreal, having a woman in his home, preparing to share his space. He couldn't remember the last time he'd exchanged more than cursory words with anyone, let alone hosted a guest overnight. As the fire caught and began to warm the room, Isaac realized another complication: food. His typical evening meal consisted of whatever was simplest, often just beans and hardtack, that hardly seemed adequate for a guest. "I should check if there's anything worth eating," he said awkwardly, moving to the small pantry shelf. Theresa set her small travel bag down. "Please, let me help. It's the least I can do for your hospitality." Before he could object, she had removed her traveling jacket and rolled up her sleeves. There was something unexpected about her readiness to work that caught Isaac off guard. He had assumed an eastern city woman would expect to be waited upon, yet Theresa approached the modest kitchen area with practical determination. Together, they assembled a surprisingly decent meal from Isaac's limited stores: beans enhanced with dried herbs, venison he'd smoked the previous week, and biscuits Theresa somehow managed to create from the flour and lard he hadn't known what to do with. As they sat at his small table, eating by lantern light, the strangeness of the situation struck Isaac anew. Here was this woman, cultured and educated, sharing his rough table as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "How long have you been ranching here?" Theresa asked, breaking the silence. Isaac considered the question. "Built this place 4 years ago, worked as a ranch hand before that, saving every penny. Started with just 10 head of cattle and built up slowly." "All on your own?" There was genuine curiosity in her voice. He nodded. "That's how it works best. No one to disappoint, no one to worry about." "Simple." Teresa's eyes studied him over the rim of her cup. "Sounds lonely." "Sounds peaceful," he corrected. "The frontier isn't kind to families. I've seen too many men lose everything trying to protect wives and children from things you can't fight: sickness, drought, harsh winters." "So you chose isolation as protection?" The directness of her question, free from judgment but penetrating nonetheless, caught him off guard. Most people in these parts didn't ask such personal questions, respecting the unspoken code that a man's choices were his own business. "I chose what made sense," Isaac replied finally. "What about you?" "Coming west alone isn't exactly conventional for an Eastern lady." Theresa set down her cup. "After my parents died, I found myself with few options. I could marry quickly out of necessity, as my father's cousin strongly suggested, or I could accept my uncle's invitation." A small smile played at her lips. "I chose what made sense." The echo of his own words wasn't lost on Isaac. Despite their different backgrounds, they had both made choices based on survival rather than sentiment. It created an unexpected bridge between them, a mutual understanding that neither had arrived at their current circumstance through romantic notions. After dinner, an awkward tension returned as the practicalities of sharing such a small space became apparent. Isaac gathered extra blankets for himself and showed Theresa to the bedroom. "It's not much," he apologized again, suddenly aware of the room's Spartan nature: "just a bed with a handmade quilt, a small trunk, and a hook on the wall for clothing." "It's perfectly adequate," she assured him. "I've imposed enough without complaints." Standing in the doorway, lantern casting warm light across her features, Theresa suddenly seemed more real than anyone Isaac had encountered in years. Not an abstract threat to his independence, but a person with her own losses and determination. "Good night, Isaac," she said softly, "and thank you." "Night," he managed, retreating to his makeshift bed near the fire. As he lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving quietly in his bedroom, Isaac confronted an uncomfortable truth. The solitude he had convinced himself was freedom suddenly felt like something else entirely. Something closer to emptiness. It was a dangerous thought, one that threatened the foundations of the life he'd built. Isaac pushed it away, attributing it to the strangeness of the day. By tomorrow, he told himself, her uncle would likely return, and things would go back to normal. Yet as he drifted toward sleep, Isaac couldn't quite convince himself that normal would ever feel the same again. Morning arrived with golden light filtering through the cabin's small windows. Isaac woke disoriented, unused to sleeping beside the fireplace rather than in his bed. For a moment, he couldn't remember why until the sound of movement in his bedroom brought yesterday's events rushing back. He rose quickly, stoking the fire and putting coffee on before Theresa emerged. There was ranch work to be done, regardless of his unexpected guest, and he needed to figure out how to manage both responsibilities. The bedroom door opened and Theresa appeared, already dressed in a simpler day dress than yesterday's traveling attire. Her hair was neatly braided rather than pinned up, giving her a more frontier-appropriate appearance. Isaac was struck by how quickly she seemed to be adapting. "Good morning," she offered, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. The morning light revealed the strangeness of their situation more clearly than the previous evening's shadows. "Morning," he replied, pouring coffee into his two mismatched cups. "Hope you slept all right." "I did, thank you," she accepted the offered coffee. "I was thinking we might ride to my uncle's ranch this morning to see if he's returned." Isaac nodded. "Makes sense. I need to check my herd first, then we can head over." "Your herd?" Interest sparked in her eyes. "Could I come along? I've never seen a real cattle operation up close." The request caught him off guard. Taking her along would slow him down, yet something in her genuine curiosity made refusal difficult. "It's not exciting work," he warned. "Perhaps not to you," she countered, "but I came west to understand this life. How better to learn than by observation?" Logic he couldn't argue with. After a quick breakfast, they saddled the horses, and Isaac was surprised to find Theresa needed little help. She had clearly been paying attention the day before, learning even as she experienced her first frontier journey. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn as they rode toward the north pasture where Isaac's small herd, now nearly 50 head, grazed. He found himself pointing out landmarks, explaining water sources and grazing patterns. Theresa listened with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed a practical mind behind her refined appearance. "How do you manage all this alone?" she asked as they crested a rise overlooking the cattle. "It seems like overwhelming work for one person." "It is," Isaac admitted, "but hiring help costs money and good help is hard to find. Most men want their own spread eventually. Few are content working someone else's land forever." "Is that what you did, worked others' land until you could claim your own?" Isaac nodded, surprised by her perceptiveness. "Started as a ranch hand at 15 after my parents died. Worked 10 years before I had enough saved to start this place." Theresa was quiet for a moment, watching the cattle graze in the distance. "We have that in common then. Both orphaned, both seeking independence rather than charity." The parallel hadn't occurred to Isaac, but she was right. Despite their different backgrounds, they shared a core experience, the determination to forge their own path after loss. They rode among the cattle, Isaac checking for signs of illness or injury. To his surprise, Theresa showed no fear of the large animals, maintaining a respectful distance but observing with keen interest. "They seem healthy," she commented. "Even I can see that." "They are," Isaac agreed, a note of pride creeping into his voice. "This year's calves are strong. If prices hold at market, it'll be my best season yet." "And what will you do then?" "Expand." The question gave him pause. He had always focused on survival, on building security. The idea of expanding, of growing beyond what he alone could manage, implied a future he hadn't allowed himself to consider. "Haven't thought that far ahead," he said finally. "One season at a time out here." Theresa nodded, accepting his answer without judgment. As they turned back toward the ranch house, Isaac found himself unusually aware of her presence beside him, not as an intrusion but as a companion. It was disconcerting how quickly he'd grown accustomed to having someone to talk with, to explain things to. After returning to the cabin for a quick midday meal, they set out for Mapleton's ranch. Isaac told himself he was hoping to find her uncle returned, resolving this unexpected situation. Yet a part of him he didn't want to acknowledge found himself hoping for a bit more time before that resolution came. As they approached Mapleton's property, Isaac immediately noticed signs of activity: smoke from the chimney, horses in the corral, men working near the barn. "Your uncle's back," he observed, pointing to the activity ahead. Theresa's face brightened with relief and anticipation. As they rode into the yard, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair emerged from the barn. Robert Mapleton's weathered face registered first surprise, then joy as he recognized his niece. "Theresa," he called, striding forward as they dismounted. "My dear girl, we weren't expecting you until tomorrow." She embraced her uncle warmly. "The stage arrived early in Silver Creek yesterday. When we came here, you were gone." Mapleton turned to Isaac, extending his hand. "Quinn, I appreciate you looking after my niece. Got back late last night and found your note. Would have come for her this morning if you hadn't brought her by." Isaac shook the offered hand. It was no trouble. An awkward moment followed as Mapleton glanced between them, clearly processing the implications of his niece spending the night at a bachelor's home. Theresa addressed the unspoken concern directly. "Mr. Quinn was the perfect gentleman, uncle. He gave me his bedroom and slept by the fire. It was the only proper solution given the circumstances." Mapleton nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Of course, Quinn's got a solid reputation. Still, I'm grateful you weren't alone out here with those good-for-nothing hands who abandoned their posts." He shot a dark look toward the men working by the barn. "Found them in town last night and sobered them up quick. They'll be working double shifts for a week to make up for it." As Theresa's trunks were unloaded and taken inside, Isaac found himself lingering, unsure of the proper protocol. His duty was clearly finished. He had delivered Theresa safely to her family. There was no reason to stay, yet he found himself reluctant to leave. Theresa seemed to sense his awkwardness. She approached him by the horses, away from her uncle's watchful eye. "Thank you again for your kindness," she said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "I know it wasn't what you planned." "Like I said, it was no trouble." Isaac shifted, uncomfortable with her thanks. "I hope you find what you're looking for out here." She studied him for a moment. "Perhaps we'll see each other again, being neighbors." Perhaps, he agreed, though experience suggested otherwise. Neighboring ranches might as well be in different territories for all the socializing that typically occurred. As he mounted his horse to leave, Theresa called out once more, "Isaac, I meant what I said about your ranch. It may be smaller than this one, but there's pride in building something yourself." Something about her words, the recognition of what his modest spread truly represented, struck Isaac deeply. He nodded, unable to find an adequate response, and turned his horse toward home. Riding back to his cabin, Isaac was struck by how different the return journey felt compared to his usual solitary rides. The land looked the same, his responsibilities remained unchanged, yet something fundamental had shifted. The silence that had once seemed peaceful now echoed with absence. That evening, as he prepared his simple dinner alone, Isaac found himself setting two places before catching himself. He removed the extra plate with a self-deprecating shake of his head. One day of company and he was already forgetting his usual routines. Yet as he ate in silence, the emptiness of the cabin pressed in around him more noticeably than ever before. It had taken just one day, one unexpected encounter, to make him question certainties he had lived by for years. Isaac told himself it would pass, that the disruption to his routine had merely unsettled him temporarily. That the life he had chosen remained the sensible one for a man on the frontier. But as he lay in his bed that still carried the faintest trace of lavender from its previous occupant, Isaac couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, not in his circumstances, but in himself. And that realization was more unsettling than any physical danger the frontier had ever presented. 3 weeks passed before Isaac saw Theresa again, though thoughts of her disrupted his carefully ordered existence with unexpected frequency. He found himself wondering how she was adjusting to ranch life, whether Mapleton's place suited her, if she missed the comforts of Eastern living. Such thoughts were pointless distractions, he told himself repeatedly. Yet they persisted, usually at the quietest moments of his day, during evening meals or while watching stars emerge over the mountains. The encounter, when it finally came, happened in Silver Creek. Isaac had ridden in for supplies and mail, planning the quick, efficient trip he preferred. He was loading purchases onto his packhorse when a familiar voice called his name. "Isaac." "I thought that was you." He turned to find Theresa approaching, a basket over her arm, dressed in a practical day dress of green calico with her honey-blonde hair braided and pinned up. The frontier had already begun to mark her. Her face showed the slight tan of someone who spent time outdoors, and her movements had the confidence of growing familiarity with her surroundings. "Theresa," he acknowledged, surprised by how pleased he felt at the sight of her. "Settling in all right?" "Yes, quite well," she replied, stepping closer. "Uncle Robert has been wonderfully patient, teaching me about ranch operations. I've even learned to help with the cooking for the hands." Isaac nodded, trying to imagine this educated Eastern woman preparing meals for rough cowboys. Somehow the image came easier than it should have. "Your uncle's a good man," he offered. "Runs a solid operation." "He speaks highly of you as well," she said. "Says you've accomplished more alone than most men do with a full crew." The compliment, second-hand though it was, caught Isaac off guard. He'd never considered that neighbors might think anything of his solitary efforts. An awkward silence threatened until Theresa spoke again. "Uncle Robert is hosting a small gathering this Saturday evening. Nothing formal, just neighbors and some of the townspeople. He asked me to invite you personally if I saw you." Isaac's instinctive response was refusal. Social gatherings were precisely the kind of entanglement he avoided, full of expectations and complications that distracted from the business of survival. "I appreciate the invitation, but—" "Before you refuse," Theresa interrupted gently, "consider that connections with neighbors can be practical as well as social. Uncle says the winters here sometimes require cooperation between ranches." Her framing of the invitation in terms of practicality, rather than social obligation, gave Isaac pause. It was true that winter emergencies sometimes necessitated neighborly assistance, and he had deliberately limited such connections over the years. "I'll consider it," he said finally, a significant concession from his usual outright refusal. Teresa's smile suggested she recognized it as such. Good, 8 o'clock, though people will likely arrive earlier. Nothing fancy, Uncle says most gatherings here are practical affairs. As she turned to go, she added, "It would be nice to show my gratitude for your help that first day." With that, she walked away, leaving Isaac with the unsettling realization that he was already mentally rearranging his Saturday plans. By the time Saturday evening arrived, Isaac had talked himself into and out of attending Mapleton's gathering at least a dozen times. The practical benefits Theresa had mentioned were real enough, but they hardly outweighed the discomfort of social interaction. Yet as dusk approached, he found himself cleaning up more thoroughly than usual, shaving away his stubble and donning his one decent shirt, a concession to civilization he rarely bothered with. Before he could reconsider, he was saddling his horse and heading toward Mapleton's ranch, telling himself it was merely neighborly obligation. The sound of music and conversation reached him before he arrived, a fiddle playing a lively tune, punctuated by laughter and the murmur of voices. Lanterns hung from the porch and nearby trees, casting warm light over the yard where people gathered in small groups. Isaac recognized most faces, ranchers from nearby properties, townspeople from Silver Creek, cowboys from various spreads. It was a typical frontier gathering, lacking the formality of Eastern social events but serving the same purpose of connection in an isolated landscape. He dismounted, tying his horse among the others, and stood momentarily at the edge of the gathering. These were moments when his self-imposed isolation felt most unnatural, watching others converse easily while he remained apart, a habit now rather than a conscious choice. "You came," Teresa's voice beside him sent an unexpected jolt through Isaac. She wore a simple dress of deep blue that complemented her eyes, her hair arranged more carefully than during their town encounter. "Said I'd consider it," he replied, suddenly aware of how awkward he felt. "And clearly you considered favorably." Her smile held genuine pleasure at his presence. "Come, let me introduce you to some people Uncle says you should know." Before Isaac could protest, Theresa had taken his arm, guiding him into the gathering with a natural ease that gave him no choice but to follow. To his surprise, the introductions she facilitated were not merely social but practical: a horse breeder with promising stock, a merchant who bought cattle at fair prices, a blacksmith who did quality work. "Your niece has quite the talent for making useful connections," Isaac commented when Mapleton joined them later in the evening. The older man chuckled. "Theresa has always been observant. 3 weeks here and she already understands the patterns of local business better than some who have lived here for years." Pride colored his voice. "She's been asking questions about everyone's operations, including yours." Isaac raised an eyebrow, glancing toward where Theresa stood conversing with the local schoolteacher. "Mine, there's not much to tell." "On the contrary," Mapleton replied, "building what you have alone at your age, it's impressive, Quinn. Most men would have taken shortcuts or gone into debt." "You've been patient, methodical." The unexpected praise from a respected rancher left Isaac momentarily speechless. He had never considered his approach noteworthy, merely necessary given his circumstances. "Just doing what makes sense," he said finally. "Well, sense isn't as common as the name suggests," Mapleton observed dryly, "especially out here." As the evening progressed, Isaac found himself more comfortable than anticipated. The conversations remained practical rather than frivolous, focused on cattle prices, weather predictions, and frontier news. Even the dancing that began later was simple and unpretentious, frontier reels and squares that required more enthusiasm than skill. He was content to observe until Theresa approached again, slightly flushed from dancing. "You haven't danced once," she noted. "Do you not know the steps?" The challenge in her tone was gentle but unmistakable. Isaac had avoided dancing through the simple expedient of never attending gatherings where it might occur. "Never had reason to learn," he admitted. "Then tonight seems an excellent opportunity." She held out her hand, a gesture both invitation and dare. "This next one is simple enough, I'll show you." Every instinct told Isaac to refuse. Dancing meant physical closeness, meant making a spectacle of himself, meant stepping further away from the detachment he had cultivated for years. Yet he found himself taking her offered hand, allowing her to lead him toward the cleared space where others were gathering for the next dance. Her smile at his acquiescence held a triumph that suggested she understood exactly how significant his consent was. The dance was indeed simple, a circle formation with basic steps and turns. Theresa guided him through it with patient instruction, her hand warm in his during the turns, her laughter generous when he misstepped. Isaac found himself relaxing incrementally, focusing on her guidance rather than the eyes of others. See. Not so terrible after all, she said as the dance ended. Not terrible, he conceded, surprised to find he meant it. As they moved away from the dancing area, Theresa kept pace beside him. May I ask you something, Isaac? He nodded, bracing himself for whatever personal inquiry she might make. Her directness no longer surprised him, it seemed fundamental to her character. Why did you really help me that first day? She asked, her voice lowered for privacy. You could have directed me to someone else or simply pointed the way to Uncle's ranch. The question caught him off guard. He had assumed his motivations were obvious, basic frontier courtesy extended to a woman in need. Would have been wrong to leave you stranded, he said simply. Perhaps, she acknowledged. But there were others who could have helped. You went far beyond mere obligation. Isaac considered her question more carefully, searching for an honest answer. I suppose you seemed different. Not helpless, just what? Determined, he finished, like someone who would make the best of things, not complain about frontier hardships. Theresa studied him, seeming to weigh his response. That's quite the assessment from a brief encounter. I'm usually right about people, Isaac said, then added with reluctant honesty, though I rarely give myself the chance to find out. Her laugh was soft but genuine. At least you're aware of it. After a moment, she continued more seriously, I think perhaps we recognized something in each other that day, a certain self-reliance born of necessity rather than choice. The observation was uncomfortably perceptive, penetrating defenses Isaac had maintained for years. Before he could respond, Mapleton called for Theresa's assistance with some matter, and she excused herself with a promise to return. Left alone, Isaac found himself watching her move through the gathering, gracious with everyone, yet maintaining an observant distance that seemed familiar because it mirrored his own tendency to assess rather than simply participate. For the first time, he considered the possibility that Theresa's composure might conceal an isolation not unlike his own, different in nature but similar in effect. The thought created an unexpected sense of kinship that unsettled him more than any physical attraction could have. When it came time to leave, Isaac found himself among the last to depart rather than the first as he would have expected. Theresa walked him to his horse, away from the remaining guests. I'm glad you came, she said simply. It was interesting, he admitted. Your uncle knows good people. Will you come again? Uncle says these gatherings happen every few weeks, especially as winter approaches. Isaac hesitated. The evening had been less uncomfortable than anticipated, yet it represented exactly the kind of engagement he had avoided for years. Perhaps, he said finally, unwilling to commit but equally unwilling to refuse outright. Theresa seemed to understand the concession this represented. That's all anyone can ask. She hesitated, then added, you have an open invitation to visit, you know. Neighbors should know each other better than passing greetings. As Isaac rode home under star-filled skies, he found himself contemplating her parting words. The foundation of his existence had been the precise opposite philosophy, that neighbors were best kept at respectful distances, interactions limited to necessity. Yet for the first time in years, that conviction felt less like wisdom and more like habit, a pattern established for protection that might now be serving as a prison. The thought followed him home, taking root alongside the memory of Theresa's hand in his during the dance, her laughter when he misstepped, her perceptive observations about his nature. In the quiet of his cabin, Isaac recognized the danger such thoughts represented. Attachments made men vulnerable, and vulnerability on the frontier could be fatal. Yet as he prepared for sleep, he found himself wondering if the greater risk might be continuing as he had been, safe but increasingly hollow. It was not a comfortable realization for a man who had built his life around certainties. But as autumn progressed toward winter, Isaac found those certainties increasingly difficult to maintain. October brought the first frost, painting the landscape in crystalline white each morning before the sun reclaimed the day. Isaac's routine expanded unexpectedly to include occasional visits to Mapleton's ranch, ostensibly to discuss winter preparations or cattle matters, but increasingly because the company had become something he found himself seeking rather than avoiding. Theresa was usually present during these visits, sometimes participating in discussions of ranch business, other times merely working nearby at household tasks. Her presence had become a comfort rather than a disruption, her insights into both frontier challenges and human nature increasingly valuable to Isaac. On one such visit in late October, he arrived to find her alone, Robert having ridden to a neighboring ranch on business. He should be back by evening, she explained, inviting Isaac inside despite the impropriety of receiving a man alone. The frontier's practical necessities often overrode Eastern social conventions. Would you like coffee while you wait, or you could come back tomorrow if you prefer? The sensible choice would be to return when her uncle was present. Yet Isaac found himself accepting the coffee, following her into the kitchen where she had been preserving the last of the garden's harvest. You've adapted well, he observed, watching her move confidently around the kitchen that would have been foreign territory to her just months ago. Theresa smiled, pouring coffee into cups. Necessity is an excellent teacher, though I still have much to learn about frontier living. As they sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from their cups, Isaac was struck by the domesticity of the scene, so far removed from his solitary existence, yet somehow not uncomfortable. Uncle says we should expect snow within the month, Theresa said, glancing toward the window where gray clouds gathered on the horizon. Is your place prepared? The question held genuine concern rather than mere conversation. Isaac nodded. Stocked enough to last through spring thaw if necessary, frontier winters teach preparedness quickly. Or they teach fatal lessons, she said soberly. Uncle has told me about families who didn't survive their first winter here. Her understanding of frontier realities, neither romanticized nor feared but accepted as challenges to be managed, continually surprised Isaac. In just months she had shed Eastern naivety without losing her fundamental optimism. It's why I questioned your coming west, he admitted. City folk often don't realize what they're facing out here. Theresa studied him over her cup. Is that why you live alone? Fear for others' safety. The directness of the question might have offended Isaac from anyone else. From Theresa, it merely felt like the continuation of an ongoing conversation about choices and consequences. Partly, he acknowledged. Seen too many men destroyed by losing families they couldn't protect, better not to risk it. And yet people continue to come west to build families despite the risks, she observed. Is survival alone truly living, Isaac? The question hung between them, challenging foundations Isaac had never fully articulated even to himself. Before he could formulate a response, hoofbeats outside announced Robert's return, ending their private conversation. That evening, riding home beneath gathering storm clouds, Isaac found Theresa's question following him like a shadow. Is survival alone truly living? For years, he had convinced himself that it was, that independence and self-sufficiency represented the height of frontier achievement. Now, with winter approaching and the prospect of months of isolation ahead, that conviction felt increasingly hollow. His cabin, once a symbol of hard-won security, suddenly seemed more like a cell he had built around himself, brick by brick, year by lonely year. The first major snowfall came in early November, blanketing the landscape in white silence. Isaac woke to a transformed world, pristine drifts surrounding his cabin, trees weighted with snow, the distant mountains barely visible through swirling flakes that continued to fall. Routine guided him through morning chores, breaking ice in water troughs, feeding livestock, ensuring his supplies remained dry and protected. The work was harder in winter, each task requiring additional effort against the elements. By midday, the snowfall had intensified. Isaac stood in his doorway, assessing the weather with practiced eyes. This was no ordinary storm. The heavy clouds and driving wind suggested a serious blizzard developing. He would need to bring the closest cattle into the sheltered area near the barn before visibility worsened further. As he prepared to venture out again, a movement on the distant road caught his attention, a lone rider struggling through deepening snow, heading in his direction. Even at this distance, something in the rider's posture triggered alarm. They were having difficulty, the horse clearly struggling against the strengthening wind. Isaac didn't hesitate. He saddled his most sure-footed horse and rode toward the traveler, concern mounting as the distance closed. No one with sense would be out in developing weather like this unless the need was desperate. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. It was Theresa, her cloak white with accumulated snow, her face red from cold beneath her hat. Her horse was laboring, each step increasingly difficult in the deepening drifts. "Theresa," he called against the wind as he reached her, "what in God's name are you doing out in this?" Relief washed over her features as she recognized him. "Isaac, thank heavens. I was afraid I'd lost the way." "You shouldn't be out at all. Where's your uncle? Why are you riding alone in a blizzard?" "Uncle Robert is laid up with a broken leg," she explained, her voice shaking with cold. "Fell from the barn loft yesterday. His foreman rode for the doctor, but with this storm," she gestured to the worsening conditions. We needed medicine for the pain and fever. No one could be spared from the ranch, so I volunteered to ride to town. Isaac's concern transformed to alarm. Town, that's 8 miles in the opposite direction, you're completely off course. Dismay filled her eyes, the landmarks disappeared in the snow. I thought I was following the creek, but everything looks different. You could have frozen to death, Isaac said, the thought sending ice through his veins that had nothing to do with the temperature. My place is closest. We need to get you warm. They rode side by side, Isaac leading her horse through worsening conditions. By the time they reached his cabin, the blizzard had fully engulfed them, visibility reduced to mere feet. Theresa was shivering violently, her cloak crusted with ice, her fingers too numb to properly dismount. Isaac lifted her from the saddle, carrying her inside with an urgency born of genuine fear. Frontier winters killed the unprepared, and despite her strength of character, Theresa had been dangerously close to becoming another victim of the unforgiving landscape. Inside, he set her near the fire, stoking it higher before helping remove her frozen outer garments. Her dress beneath was damp from melted snow, her face alarmingly pale except for patches of angry red where the cold had bitten deepest. You need dry clothes, he said, practicality overriding any concerns about propriety. From his trunk he retrieved a clean shirt and pair of trousers. They'll be too large, but they're dry. Change while I see to the horses. When Isaac returned from stabling their mounts, he found Theresa huddled by the fire, swimming in his clothing, her damp dress hung nearby to dry. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, beginning to dry in the fire's warmth. Despite the circumstances, the sight of her in his home again, in his clothes, created a sense of rightness that disturbed him deeply. The storm's getting worse, he reported, hanging his snow-covered coat. You won't be going anywhere tonight. She nodded, accepting the reality of their situation. I'm sorry to impose again and to have been so foolish. It wasn't foolish to try helping your uncle, Isaac said, preparing coffee to warm her further. It was brave if misguided. A small smile touched her lips at his qualified praise. A kind way of saying I should have known better. Perhaps, he conceded, handing her a steaming cup, but few would attempt such a journey for someone else's sake. That says something about your character. As color gradually returned to her cheeks, Theresa explained the situation at her uncle's ranch in greater detail. Robert's fall had resulted in not just a broken leg but cracked ribs and a gash that showed signs of infection. With the foreman gone for the doctor and the hands managing essential ranch operations, she had felt compelled to seek medicine herself. He was in such pain, she said, guilt evident in her voice. I couldn't simply wait and do nothing. Your uncle wouldn't want you risking your life, Isaac pointed out gently. No medicine is worth that trade. I know, she acknowledged. She hesitated, vulnerability showing beneath her usual composure. I couldn't bear watching someone else I care for suffer when I might help. Something in her phrasing caught Isaac's attention. Someone else? Theresa looked away toward the fire. My father, at the end the influenza took him quickly, but my mother lingered in terrible pain. I sat with her, unable to ease her suffering. Her voice softened. I promised myself never to be that helpless again. The admission revealed depths to her character Isaac had sensed but not fully understood. Her journey west wasn't merely about starting over, it was about reclaiming a sense of efficacy after profound helplessness. In that moment, he recognized in Theresa the same driving force that had shaped his own life, the determination never again to be at the mercy of circumstances beyond control. I understand, he said simply, the words carrying more meaning than their simplicity suggested. Her gaze met his, recognition dawning. Yes, she replied softly, I believe you do. The blizzard raged through the night, wind howling around the cabin's sturdy walls, occasional gusts sending snow sifting through the smallest cracks. Isaac maintained the fire at full strength, ensuring the interior remained warm despite the plummeting temperatures outside. As evening deepened, their conversation continued, moving from immediate concerns to deeper sharing. The storm's isolation created a strange intimacy, two souls sheltered together against nature's fury, finding unexpected connection in shared experiences of loss and resilience. I never thanked you properly, Theresa said as they shared the simple meal Isaac had prepared. Not just for today, but for that first day, you changed the course of my life here. Isaac shook his head. You would have managed. You're stronger than most. Perhaps, she acknowledged, but kindness matters, especially when one is alone in unfamiliar territory. She studied him across the table. Why do you diminish your own good actions? The question caught him off guard, requiring self-examination he typically avoided. Doing what's necessary isn't worth praise, he said finally. It's just living properly. And if more lived by such standards, Theresa challenged gently, would the world not be better for it? Isaac had no ready answer. Her perspective continually challenged his assumptions, making him question certitudes he had lived by for years. As the evening progressed, practical matters arose, sleeping arrangements in the small cabin. Isaac insisted Theresa take the bed again while he made do near the fire, despite her protests about displacing him a second time. At least let me help with something, she insisted. I'm not helpless despite today's misadventure. Her determination to contribute rather than merely accept help further confirmed Isaac's initial assessment of her character. Together, they prepared the cabin for night, working in surprisingly comfortable tandem despite the confined space. Later, as Theresa retired to the bedroom and Isaac settled near the fire, he found himself contemplating how quickly she had come to feel like a natural presence in his home rather than an intrusion. It was as though the cabin itself had been waiting for her return, the emptiness between her visits merely a held breath. Such thoughts were dangerous, leading toward possibilities Isaac had deliberately avoided for years. Yet in the howling isolation of the blizzard, those possibilities seemed less threatening than before. Perhaps it was the storm's reminder of human frailty, or simply Theresa's genuine presence that made connection seem worth the inherent risks. Morning brought stillness. The blizzard had passed, leaving a transformed landscape of sweeping drifts and buried landmarks. Sunlight sparkled across untouched snow, creating a breathtaking vista of pristine white stretching to the distant mountains. Isaac woke early, checking conditions outside before returning to find Theresa already up, dressed in her now dry clothing, attempting to prepare breakfast from his supplies. The storm's passed, he reported, but we've got at least 3 feet of fresh snow. Travel will be difficult. Concern immediately filled her expression. Uncle will be worried sick, and he still needs medicine. I know, Isaac assured her. Once we've eaten, I'll ride with you to your uncle's ranch. Then I can continue to town for the medicine while you stay with him. Relief and gratitude washed over her features. You would do that? Of course, he replied simply, as though the matter required no consideration. In truth, it didn't. The thought of Theresa attempting another journey through deep snow was unacceptable. After a quick breakfast, they prepared for departure. The ride to Mapleton's ranch would be challenging even for 2 experienced riders, requiring careful navigation of deep drifts and hidden hazards beneath the snow. As they set out, Isaac leading the way and breaking trail, he found himself hyper-aware of Theresa's safety. Each difficult passage they encountered sent his heart racing until she negotiated it successfully. It was a foreign sensation, this acute concern for another's well-being superseding his usual self-reliance. The journey that normally took an hour stretched to nearly 3 as they carefully picked their way through the transformed landscape. When Mapleton's ranch finally came into view, smoke rising steadily from the chimney, Isaac felt relief disproportionate to the actual danger they had faced. Their arrival caused immediate commotion. Ranch hands rushed out, having clearly been watching for Theresa's return. Her uncle's worried shouts could be heard from inside the house. Once inside, they found Robert Mapleton propped in bed, his legs splinted, face pale with pain and worry. The reunion between uncle and niece was emotional, his relief palpable, his gentle scolding for her risk-taking tempered by obvious pride in her courage. Quinn, he acknowledged, gripping Isaac's hand firmly. I owe you a debt I can't repay, when the storm hit and she wasn't back. She found her way to my place, Isaac explained, got turned around in the snow. Thank God for that, Mapleton said fervently. If she'd been caught in the open. The unspoken outcome hung in the air between them, another frontier tragedy, another life claimed by unforgiving nature. The thought sent a chill through Isaac that had nothing to do with the winter cold. After ensuring Theresa was settled and explaining his plan to continue to town for medicine, Isaac prepared to depart. She walked him to the door, stepping outside briefly for a moment of privacy. This is becoming a habit, she said with a small smile, you rescuing me from frontier predicaments. You'd have managed, Isaac replied, though both knew the blizzard might have proven fatal without intervention. Theresa studied him, her expression serious despite her light tone. Will you be careful? The snow is treacherous still. Her concern warmed him more than any fire could have. I've navigated worse. I'll return by evening with medicine." She hesitated, then stepped forward and kissed his cheek, a brief warm contact that sent unexpected heat through Isaac's entire body. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." The journey to town and back passed in a blur of physical exertion and mental distraction. Isaac found himself touching his cheek occasionally, the memory of Theresa's kiss more potent than the winter cold. By the time he returned to Mapleton's ranch with the needed medicine, evening was approaching, the short winter day already surrendering to darkness. His reception was enthusiastic, the ranch hands welcoming him with relief, Mapleton expressing profound gratitude, Theresa's eyes following him with an expression he couldn't quite define but that stirred something deep within his carefully guarded heart. "You must stay the night," Mapleton insisted. "It's too dark to ride safely back to your place." Though Isaac's instinct was to return to his solitary cabin, practicality won out. Night journeys through snow-covered terrain invited disaster. He accepted the offer with quiet thanks. That evening, after the doctor's medicine had eased Mapleton's pain and the household settled into relative calm, Isaac found himself seated at the kitchen table with Theresa. The ranch hands had retired to their bunkhouse, leaving them in a privacy that felt both comfortable and charged with unspoken awareness. "You should have seen Uncle's face when I told him how I got lost," Theresa said, warming her hands around a coffee cup. "I thought he might try standing on his broken leg just to lecture me properly." Isaac smiled at the image. He was right to worry, but he should also be proud. "Not many would have attempted what you did." "Foolishness or courage, the line seems thin sometimes," she observed. "Intention makes the difference," Isaac replied. "You acted out of concern for him." "That's courage, whatever the outcome." Theresa studied him across the table, her expression thoughtful. "You've changed since we first met." The observation caught Isaac off guard. "How so?" "You speak more," she said with a small smile. "Share your thoughts rather than just practical information. And you're here in someone else's home, when 3 months ago you barely acknowledged neighbors existed." Her assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Isaac had indeed changed, though he had avoided examining those changes too closely, fearing what they might reveal about his shifting priorities. "Perhaps," he acknowledged. "Or perhaps I just found someone worth talking to." The words emerged before he could censor them, more revelation than he had intended. Yet seeing Theresa's expression soften in response, he couldn't bring himself to regret them. "I'm glad," she said simply. "Isolation doesn't suit you as well as you think it does, Isaac Quinn." They talked late into the evening, conversation flowing with surprising ease between practical matters and deeper reflections. When they finally parted for the night, Theresa to her room, Isaac to the spare bedroom typically used for guests, something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of connection neither had actively sought yet both now valued. The following morning brought clear skies and slightly warmer temperatures that began melting the uppermost layer of snow. After checking on Mapleton and ensuring the medicine continued to help, Isaac prepared to return to his ranch. The daily needs of livestock couldn't be postponed, regardless of weather or personal inclination. Theresa walked with him to the stable, watching as he saddled his horse. "Will you come back soon?" she asked directly. "Uncle enjoys your company and," she hesitated, "so do I." The admission, simple as it was, struck Isaac with unexpected force. For years he had arranged his life to avoid precisely this, someone whose presence mattered, whose absence would be noted. It represented exactly the vulnerability he had determined to avoid. Yet standing before her in the crisp morning light, Isaac found his carefully constructed philosophy insufficient against the reality of Theresa herself, her courage, her intelligence, her direct gaze that expected honesty. "I will," he promised, the words committing him to more than a mere visit. As winter progressed, Isaac's world expanded in ways he had never anticipated. Regular visits to Mapleton's ranch became part of his routine, initially justified as neighborly assistance during Robert's recovery, but continuing long after the older man regained mobility. Theresa became a frequent visitor to his ranch as well, sometimes accompanied by her uncle, often riding over alone once the winter paths were established. She brought small comforts, fresh baked bread, books from her uncle's library, conversation that challenged and engaged him. With each visit, each shared meal, each discussion extending late into evening hours, the walls Isaac had built around his life weakened further. He found himself looking forward to her arrival, his formerly adequate solitude increasingly empty in her absence. December brought preparations for Christmas, a holiday Isaac typically acknowledged with minimal observance, if at all. Theresa's enthusiasm, however, proved infectious. She decorated Mapleton's ranch with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, organized a Christmas gathering for neighboring ranches, and insisted Isaac participate fully. "It's not practical," he protested when she described her plans for a proper Christmas dinner with all the traditional foods. "Not everything worthwhile is practical," she countered. "Sometimes the impractical reminds us we're more than just survivors, Isaac, we're alive." It was this perspective, her insistence on living fully rather than merely surviving, that increasingly undermined Isaac's carefully constructed philosophy. Theresa approached frontier life with clear-eyed recognition of its dangers, yet refused to allow those dangers to diminish her capacity for joy. The Christmas gathering at Mapleton's ranch drew people from miles around, a community coming together against winter's isolation. Isaac found himself participating more fully than he would have thought possible months earlier, even joining in carols and accepting a small gift from Theresa, a finely crafted leather journal with his initials burned into the cover. "For your thoughts," she explained when he opened it, "since you have more of them than you once admitted." His gift to her had been practical, a sturdy winter riding cloak lined with rabbit fur he had trapped himself. Yet he had also tucked a pressed wildflower between tissue paper, a rare autumn bloom he had preserved on impulse months earlier, thinking of her. Her delight at finding it, this impractical addition to a practical gift, confirmed something Isaac had been slowly realizing. Theresa valued both aspects of life, the necessary and the beautiful, refusing to sacrifice either. As the evening ended and guests departed, Isaac lingered, helping with cleanup despite Theresa's protests that it could wait until morning. They worked in comfortable synchronization, their months of acquaintance having established patterns of cooperation that required little discussion. When the last dishes were dried, the last decorations straightened, they found themselves alone in the main room, the fire burning low in the hearth. Robert had retired early, his legs still troubling him after the day's activities. "Thank you," Theresa said, settling beside Isaac on the small sofa, "for embracing the celebration. It meant a great deal to me." "It was nice," he admitted, "different from how I've spent previous Christmases." "Alone?" she asked gently. Isaac nodded. It seemed simpler, less reminder of what wasn't there. "And now?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning beyond its simple phrasing. Isaac looked at her, really looked, taking in the woman who had so thoroughly disrupted his carefully ordered existence. Theresa returned his gaze steadily, allowing him to see not just her beauty but her strength, her intelligence, her capacity for joy despite understanding the frontier's harsh realities. In that moment, Isaac recognized that she embodied everything he had convinced himself was impossible: connection without weakness, love without vulnerability. "Now," he said finally, "I'm not sure I remember why alone seemed preferable." Her smile at his words held such genuine warmth that Isaac felt something final give way inside him. The last defense against admitting what had been growing increasingly clear since their first meeting. He reached for her hand, a deliberate gesture unlike the practical touches they had shared before. When her fingers interlaced with his, the simple contact felt more significant than any frontier achievement he had accomplished alone. "Theresa," he began, her name itself a revelation on his lips. "I've spent years believing that survival meant isolation, that connections were liabilities rather than strengths." "And now," she prompted again, her voice soft but steady. "Now I think I was wrong," Isaac admitted, "or at least incomplete in my understanding. There's surviving and then there's living. You've shown me the difference." Her free hand rose to touch his face, a gentle contact that grounded the moment in reality rather than abstraction. "And which do you choose, Isaac?" The question required no consideration. Months of gradual awakening had prepared him for this moment of clarity, this recognition that his careful isolation had been less about wisdom and more about fear, fear dressed as practicality. "Living," he said simply, "with all its risks and rewards." When he leaned forward to kiss her, it felt less like a first step and more like a confirmation of a journey already begun. Theresa's response held the same certainty, her arms winding around his neck, her lips meeting his with a warmth that suggested she had been waiting for him to reach this conclusion at his own pace. The kiss deepened, months of growing feelings finding expression in this moment of connection. When they finally parted, Isaac rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to move further away. "I love you," he said, the words emerging with surprising ease for a man who had guarded his speech as carefully as his heart. I think I have since that first day, though I wasn't ready to know it. Theresa's smile could have illuminated the darkest winter night. I know, she replied. I've been waiting for you to realize it. Her confidence, not arrogant but certain, drew a laugh from Isaac, the sound unfamiliar even to his own ears. Was I that transparent? To someone watching closely. Yes, her fingers traced his jawline with tender curiosity. I loved you before I knew you fully, Isaac Quinn. Every revelation since has only confirmed what my heart recognized immediately. The admission should have frightened him, this acknowledgement of feelings that created vulnerability, that complicated the straightforward business of survival. Instead, Isaac found himself embracing the very connection he had spent years avoiding, recognizing it not as weakness but as profound strength. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I've spent so long believing that loving someone on the frontier was asking for heartbreak. And it might be, Theresa acknowledged, her pragmatism one of the qualities he most valued. Life offers no guarantees, Isaac, especially out here, but is that reason enough to deny ourselves its greatest gift? The question penetrated to the heart of his long-held beliefs. Isaac had structured his entire existence around minimizing risk, ensuring survival. Yet what was survival worth without the very experiences that made life meaningful? No, he said finally. It's not reason enough. Their second kiss held promise rather than discovery, the beginning of something both acknowledged as transformative. When Isaac reluctantly prepared to leave, knowing his ranch responsibilities couldn't be neglected despite his desire to remain, Theresa walked him to his horse. Under star-filled skies, with snow glistening in moonlight around them, she looked up at him with an expression that combined love with characteristic directness. Come for dinner tomorrow, she said. I think it's time we spoke with Uncle Robert about our intentions. The word intentions might once have sent Isaac retreating to his isolated safety. Now, it filled him with anticipation rather than apprehension. Tomorrow, he agreed, sealing the promise with a final kiss before mounting his horse. As he rode home through the winter night, Isaac marveled at how completely his understanding of frontier life had transformed. What he had once seen as solitary endurance now appeared as a landscape of possibilities, challenges faced together rather than alone, joys shared rather than denied, a future built on partnership rather than isolation. The cabin that awaited him, once his pride as symbol of self-sufficiency, now seemed incomplete, a foundation rather than a finished structure. For the first time, Isaac allowed himself to imagine it expanded, improved, filled with something beyond mere survival. His journal, Theresa's Christmas gift, lay waiting on the table. Isaac opened it to the first blank page and began to write, putting into words the transformation that had occurred not in the landscape around him, but in the territory of his heart. By the time he finished, dawn was approaching, pale light seeping through the eastern window. Yet Isaac felt no fatigue, only clarity and purpose that had been absent even in his most productive previous days. The morning chores passed quickly, his mind occupied with anticipation of the evening ahead. By early afternoon, unable to wait longer, Isaac saddled his horse and rode toward Mapleton's ranch, rehearsing what he would say to Robert, the formal request for permission to court Theresa properly, despite the frontier's typical disregard for such conventions. He arrived to find Robert on the porch despite the cold, seemingly waiting for him. The older man's expression was knowing rather than surprised, suggesting Theresa had already spoken with him. Quinn, he greeted, rising to shake Isaac's hand, right on time. Sir, Isaac replied, suddenly formal, I'd like to speak with you about my niece, Mapleton finished for him. I figured as much, come inside where it's warm. No sense freezing while we discuss the future. Inside, seated before the fire with coffee Mapleton prepared himself, Isaac found his carefully practiced speech unnecessary. The older man spoke first, direct as always. Theresa told me about your conversation last night, he said. Can't say I'm surprised, been watching this develop for months. Isaac straightened, then you know I've come to ask formal permission to court her. Mapleton's weathered face creased in a smile. Court her, son, you've been doing that since the day you brought her to my door. Neither of you may have recognized it then, but these old eyes saw it plain enough. The observation, so at odds with Isaac's perception of his own actions, momentarily silenced him. Had his transformation been so gradual he hadn't recognized its progression, or had Theresa's arrival simply revealed what had always been possible, given the right catalyst? I love her, Isaac said simply. I never expected to feel this way about anyone, never thought it was possible out here. Mapleton studied him over the rim of his coffee cup. The frontier tests people, Quinn breaks many. But it also reveals character like nothing else can. You've proven yours over years of honest dealings and hard work. Theresa proved hers by adapting to challenges that would have sent most Eastern women fleeing back to civilization. He set his cup down decisively. You have my blessing, though I suspect you'd proceed with or without it. Theresa makes her own decisions, always has. It's one of the qualities that will serve both of you well in the life you're planning. The conversation continued, moving from formal permission to practical considerations of the future. Mapleton mentioned his intention to eventually leave his ranch to Theresa as his only living relative, creating the possibility of joint properties that would make a significant operation. Not that land matters compared to happiness, the older man added, but it's worth considering in your planning. When Theresa returned from visiting a neighboring ranch family, she found Isaac and her uncle deep in discussion of spring cattle operations. The sight these two men she loved most in the world finding common ground brought a smile to her face that illuminated the room more effectively than the crackling fire. The evening that followed held a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place after long separation. As the three shared dinner, conversation flowing easily between practical matters and future plans, Isaac found himself fully present in a way he had rarely experienced, engaged not just with immediate concerns but with possibilities that extended beyond the next season. Later, when Robert retired early as was his custom, Isaac and Theresa found themselves alone by the fire, her hand clasped in his, the future suddenly expansive rather than threatening. Your uncle gave his blessing, Isaac told her. Though he seems to think it's merely confirming what's already been decided. Theresa's laugh was soft but joyful. Uncle Robert sees more than he says. He's known my heart longer than I admitted it to myself. And what does your heart say now? Isaac asked, needing to hear the words directly from her. She turned to face him fully, firelight gilding her features with warm light. It says that I love you, Isaac Quinn, that I crossed a continent to find you, though I didn't know it then. That the frontier isn't just a place of hardship but of possibility, the possibility of building something meaningful together. Her words articulating exactly what he had been feeling, confirmed again why they had connected so deeply despite different backgrounds. Theresa understood not just the challenges of frontier life, but its potential for genuine fulfillment beyond mere survival. I want to marry you, Isaac said, the declaration emerging with certainty rather than hesitation. Not someday, not when conditions are perfect, soon, this spring. Her smile suggested she had been waiting for precisely this. Yes, she replied simply, this spring sounds perfect. As winter gradually yielded to the first hesitant signs of spring, Isaac worked with renewed purpose. His cabin, no longer adequate for the future he envisioned, required expansion. With help from neighboring ranchers, including men he had previously kept at formal distance, he added a proper second bedroom, enlarged the main living area, and constructed a covered porch where summer evenings could be enjoyed. Theresa visited regularly, bringing furnishings from her uncle's house, contributing ideas for the home they would share. Together, they planned not just physical spaces but the shape of their future, how the ranches might eventually operate together, where improvements could be made, what kind of life they wanted to build. Word of their engagement spread through the community, bringing congratulations and offers of assistance that continued to surprise Isaac, who had never fully appreciated how his years of quiet integrity had earned him the respect of neighbors he had kept at arm's length. The transformation extended beyond physical improvements. Isaac found himself engaging more fully with the community, participating in discussions about territorial development, contributing to decisions that would shape the region's future. The connection he had once feared as vulnerability now provided strength, a network of relationships that enriched rather than threatened his existence. Spring arrived in full by late April, painting the landscape in fresh green, wildflowers emerging from soil recently released from snow's grasp. The date was set for early May, when weather would likely cooperate while still preceding the busiest season of ranching operations. On the morning of their wedding day, Isaac stood on his porch, their porch now, with Theresa's touches evident in curtains at windows and flowers in pots, and marveled at how completely his life had transformed in less than a year. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, held at Mapleton's ranch with the entire community in attendance. The local preacher officiated, binding their lives officially, though Isaac knew the true joining had begun months earlier, with a chance encounter that had challenged everything he believed about frontier existence. Theresa, dressed in a simple but elegant white dress she had ordered from back east, looked at him with such certainty that any lingering doubts about vulnerability evaporated. When they spoke their vows, promises to face life's challenges together rather than alone, Isaac recognized them not as empty words but as articulation of the truth they had already been living. The celebration afterward reflected frontier practicality combined with genuine joy, abundant food, music for dancing, congratulations from neighbors who had watched their relationship develop over the changing seasons. Robert Mapleton beamed with pride, clearly satisfied with the match his niece had made despite its unconventional beginnings. As evening approached and guests began departing, Isaac found a moment alone with his new father-in-law on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson. "Never thought I'd see this day," Mapleton admitted, his gruff voice softened by emotion. "You building a family instead of just a ranch." "Neither did I," Isaac acknowledged. "She changed everything." The older man nodded thoughtfully. "Some people do that, they come into your life and suddenly all your careful plans seem insufficient. The smart ones recognize the blessing when it happens." "I almost didn't," Isaac admitted. "Almost held to what I thought was wisdom rather than seeing the truth in front of me." "But you did see it," Mapleton pointed out. "That's what matters in the end." Later that night, after the last guests had departed and they were finally alone in their expanded home, Isaac and Theresa stood on their new porch, watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. Her head rested against his shoulder, his arm secure around her waist, their bodies fitting together as naturally as their lives had merged. "Happy?" he asked, still sometimes amazed that this extraordinary woman had chosen to share his life. Theresa looked up at him, her eyes reflecting starlight. "Completely, though happy seems inadequate for what I feel." Isaac understood exactly what she meant. The emotion encompassing them transcended simple happiness, incorporating deeper elements of belonging, purpose, and mutual recognition that defied easy categorization. "I spent so many years believing the frontier allowed only one path to survival," he mused. "Turns out there was another way all along." "Not an easier way," Theresa pointed out practically. "Just a more complete one." Her assessment, as always, penetrated to the heart of the matter. The path they had chosen wasn't free from the frontier's inherent challenges and dangers. It simply faced those realities together rather than alone, finding strength in shared purpose rather than isolated endurance. As they entered their home, truly theirs now in every sense, Isaac realized that the transformation in his understanding went beyond personal happiness. What had changed was his fundamental perception of frontier life itself, not as a harsh teacher of isolation, but as a landscape where the deepest human connections could form precisely because of the challenges that demanded facing together. "I love you," he told her as they prepared for their first night as husband and wife. The words, once unimaginable in his vocabulary, now came easily, a truth as fundamental as the ground beneath their home. "And I love you," Theresa replied, her hands framing his face with tender certainty. "Enough to cross a continent, to brave blizzards, to build a life neither of us could have imagined a year ago." As they embraced in the quiet sanctuary of their shared home, Isaac recognized that the journey from strangers to soulmates had been neither straightforward nor painless. It had required dismantling beliefs he had thought fundamental to survival, embracing vulnerability he had spent years avoiding, recognizing strength in connection rather than isolation. Yet the reward transcended any risk, any discomfort of change. In Theresa's arms, Isaac found not just personal happiness but a deeper truth about frontier existence, that its greatest challenge was not merely surviving, but creating a life worth the struggles it demanded. Together they had found that life, transforming separate journeys of survival into a shared path of genuine living. And in that transformation, the harsh landscape that had once seemed to demand isolation had instead revealed its greatest gift, the possibility of finding home not in a place but in each other.